My parents made me sign papers, saying I abused my children. CPS had been building a case against them. I'm Erika. I was standing in my kitchen making Emma's lunch when my phone rang. My mother's voice was sharp, urgent. You need to come. Over right now. Bring the papers we discussed. My hands trembled as I hung up. Those papers she mentioned claimed I had physically harmed my own children. I'd signed them 3 weeks ago under pressure, believing I was protecting my family. What I didn't know was that CPS had been quietly building a case for months, but not against me, against them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sunlight filtered through my small apartment window in Millfield, Ohio, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. I pressed my back against the kitchen counter, still gripping the phone, trying to process what had just happened. My 6-year-old daughter Emma was in the living room watching cartoons, her blonde hair catching the light as she giggled at something on screen. Tyler, my 8-year-old son, was upstairs getting ready for school, probably struggling with his shoelaces like he did every morning. This was supposed to be a normal Tuesday. Pack lunches, walk the kids to Jefferson Elementary, then head to my job at the local credit union where I worked as a loan processor. Simple, quiet, predictable. The kind of life I'd built carefully after my divorce from Mark 2 years ago. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just me and my children trying to find our footing in a world that felt safer when we kept to ourselves. But my parents had other plans. I walked to the living room where Emma sat cross-legged on our second-hand couch, her small fingers wrapped around a bowl of cereal. She looked up at me with those bright blue eyes that reminded me so much of my own childhood, back when I still believed my parents wanted what was best for me. "Mommy, are you okay?" she asked, tilting her head in that way children do when they sense something's wrong but can't quite name it. I forced a smile and smoothed her hair. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Finish your breakfast and then we'll get you ready for school." But I wasn't fine. Those papers my mother mentioned were tucked away in my bedroom drawer, folded neatly between old bank statements and Emma's first-grade artwork. I'd read them so many times the creases were wearing thin. Statement of admission regarding physical discipline incidents, they were called. Legal-sounding words that made my stomach clench every time I saw them. 3 weeks ago, my parents had cornered me in their pristine living room on Maple Street, the same house where I'd grown up trying to be invisible. My father, Robert, sat in his leather recliner, reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied some documents spread across the coffee table. My mother, Linda, paced behind him, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in that rhythmic way that always made me nervous. "Erika, we need to discuss something serious," Linda had said, her voice carrying that tone I remembered from childhood. The tone that meant I was in trouble for something I probably hadn't done. I'd been visiting because they'd called saying they wanted to discuss Christmas plans. It was only October, but my mother was the type who planned everything months in advance. I thought we'd talk about where to hold dinner, whether the kids would spend the night, normal grandparent conversations. Instead, Robert looked up from his papers and said, "There have been concerns raised about your parenting methods." My heart had stopped. "What kind of concerns?" "Aggressive discipline," Linda said, still pacing. "There were witnesses at the grocery store last month when you lost your temper with Tyler." I remembered that day vividly. Tyler had been having a meltdown in the cereal aisle because I wouldn't buy the sugary brand he wanted. He'd thrown himself on the floor, screaming and kicking. I'd knelt down, spoken to him firmly but quietly, and eventually carried him to the car when he wouldn't calm down. It was embarrassing, but it was parenting. Single parenting in public, which was never easy. "I didn't lose my temper," I'd said. "I handled a tantrum." "Mrs. Henderson from church saw the whole thing," Robert continued, adjusting his glasses. "She said you grabbed Tyler's arm roughly and spoke to him in a threatening manner." Mrs. Henderson, of course. She was one of my mother's closest friends, the type of woman who found drama in a grocery list and gossip in a weather forecast. But she was also respected in our small town, the kind of person whose word carried weight. There's also the incident at Emma's school, Linda added, finally stopping her pacing to face me directly. Her teacher mentioned that Emma seemed withdrawn after you picked her up late that day. I remembered that too. I'd been stuck at work with a difficult loan application, and traffic had been terrible. Emma had been the last child waiting in the after-school program. And yes, she'd been quiet on the drive home. But withdrawn? She'd been tired. It was a Friday afternoon, and she'd had a long week. Those are misunderstandings, I'd said, feeling defensive but trying to keep my voice steady. I would never hurt my children. We know that, Robert had said, his tone softening slightly. But perceptions matter, Erika. Especially in a town like this. Word travels fast, and once these kinds of rumors start. He'd let the sentence hang in the air like a threat. What are you asking me to do? I'd asked, though part of me already knew. Linda had reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. We've had our attorney draft something. A statement acknowledging that there have been incidents where your discipline methods may have been excessive. Nothing dramatic, just an admission that you recognize the need to adjust your approach. I'd stared at the folder like it contained poison. You want me to confess to abusing my children? Not abuse, Robert had said quickly. Overly aggressive discipline. There's a difference. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, and it's not really a confession, it's more of an acknowledgement. Something that shows you're taking responsibility and working to improve. But why? Why do I need to sign anything? That's when Linda had sat down across from me. Her expression, shifting to something that might have looked like concern to an outsider, but felt like manipulation to me. Because if you don't, and these rumors continue to spread, someone might call Child Protective Services. And you know how that goes. Once they get involved, they start looking for problems whether they exist or not. The threat was clear, even wrapped in parental concern. Sign the papers and admit to something I didn't do, or risk having my children taken away based on rumors and misunderstandings. If you sign this, Robert had continued, it shows that you're proactive about addressing concerns. It demonstrates responsibility. And it gives us something to show people who might be questioning your parenting. Look, we can say, Erika recognized there was an issue and she's handling it. I'd felt trapped in that moment, sitting in the living room where I'd spent countless childhood hours feeling small and misunderstood. My parents had always been good at making me feel like I was the problem, even when I knew I wasn't. They had a way of twisting situations until I questioned my own memory, my own instincts. I need to think about it, I'd said. Of course, Linda had replied, but there was impatience in her voice. But don't think too long. These things have a way of snowballing if they're not addressed quickly. I'd taken the folder home that night and read the documents over and over. The language was carefully crafted, acknowledging instances of physical discipline that may have exceeded appropriate bounds and expressing commitment to attending parenting classes and anger management, counseling. It made me sound like someone who'd lost control, someone who'd hurt her children in moments of frustration. But it also made it sound like I was taking responsibility, like I was a good mother who'd made mistakes and wanted to do better. And that's what my parents kept emphasizing when they called every few days to check on my decision. It's not about what actually happened, Linda would say. It's about managing the situation. You know how people talk in this town. Once they start questioning your parenting, it's hard to stop. And think about Emma and Tyler, Robert would add during his calls. If CPS gets involved, they could be taken away while investigations happen. Even if you're cleared eventually, That's trauma they don't need to experience. The fear was real. I'd heard stories about families torn apart by CPS investigations, children placed in foster care while allegations were sorted out. Even false allegations could have devastating consequences, and in a small town like Millfield, reputation mattered. If enough people started whispering about my parenting, those whispers could become official complaints. So I'd signed the papers. I'd sat at my kitchen table on a Sunday night, Emma and Tyler asleep upstairs, and I'd put my signature on documents that claimed I'd harmed my children. My hand had shaken as I wrote my name, and I'd cried afterward, feeling like I'd betrayed not just myself, but Emma and Tyler too. The next morning, I'd driven to my parents' house and handed over the signed documents. Linda had smiled and patted my shoulder. "You did the right thing, sweetheart. This protects everyone." Robert had nodded approvingly as he tucked the papers into his briefcase. "We'll keep these safe. Hopefully we'll never need them, but it's good to know they're there if anyone asks questions." That had been 3 weeks ago, and I'd tried to put it behind me. Life had returned to its normal rhythm. Work, school, dinner, homework, bedtime stories. I'd almost convinced myself that signing those papers had been the right choice, that my parents were looking out for my best interests. But this morning's phone call had changed everything. Now, standing in my living room watching Emma finish her cereal, I felt that familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. My mother's voice had been different this morning. Urgent, almost panicked. And the way she'd said, "Bring the papers we discussed," made it sound like something had happened. "Tyler!" I called upstairs. 5 minutes until we leave for school." "I can't find my library book," came his muffled reply. "Check your backpack," I called back, trying to keep my voice normal despite the churning in my chest. Emma looked up at me again, those perceptive blue eyes studying my face. "Mommy, you look worried." I knelt down beside the couch and took her small hands in mine. "Sometimes grown-ups have things to figure out, but it's nothing for you to worry about, okay? You just focus on having a good day at school." She nodded, solemnly, then brightened. "Can we make cookies tonight? The chocolate chip ones?" "We'll see," I said, though the idea of anything feeling normal enough for cookie baking seemed impossible right now. Tyler thundered down the stairs, his dark hair sticking up in 3 different directions and his backpack dragging behind. Him. Found it. It was under my pillow. I smoothed down his hair and checked his backpack, making sure he had his homework and lunch money. These were the moments I treasured, the simple routine of motherhood that reminded me who I really was. Not the person described in those papers I'd signed, but someone who packed nutritious lunches and read bedtime stories and worried about library books and math tests. The walk to Jefferson Elementary was only 6 blocks, but it felt longer today. Emma skipped beside me, pointing out dogs in windows and counting red cars, while Tyler practiced his spelling words out loud. They were happy, healthy children who laughed easily and hugged freely. They showed no signs of the trauma that would exist if I were really the kind of mother those papers described. At the school entrance, I hugged them both goodbye and watched them disappear into the crowd of children. Emma turned and waved from the doorway, her smile bright and trusting. Tyler was already deep in conversation with his best friend Jake about something involving Pokémon cards. I stood there for a moment, watching other parents say goodbye to their children. Did any of them know about the rumors Mrs. Henderson might be spreading? Did they look at me differently, wondering if I was the kind of mother who needed anger management classes? Millfield was small enough that everyone knew everyone, at least by reputation. I'd grown up here, gone to high school with many of these parents, worked with their siblings or cousins at various jobs over the years. It was the kind of place where your mistakes followed you, where a single incident could define how people saw you for years. But it was also the kind of place where family reputation mattered. And my parents, Linda and Robert, were well-respected members of the community. Robert had been a bank manager for 30 years before retiring. Linda volunteered at the library and organized the annual Christmas toy drive. They were the kind of people others looked up to, the kind whose word carried weight when they spoke about family matters. That's what made this situation so complex. If my parents said there were concerns about my parenting, people would listen. But if they also said I was addressing those concerns responsibly, people would respect that too. They had the power to shape the narrative either way. I walked slowly toward the credit union, trying to prepare myself for what awaited at my parents' house. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the leaves on the maple trees were just beginning to turn. It should have been a beautiful day, the kind that made me grateful for small-town life and simple pleasures. Instead, I felt like I was walking toward some kind of reckoning I didn't understand. The credit union where I worked was housed in a converted Victorian home on Main Street, all bay windows and gingerbread trim painted cheerful yellow. I'd been there for almost 3 years, working my way up from teller to loan processor. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and my boss, Mr. Patterson, had been understanding about single motherhood and the occasional sick day or school event. I pushed through the front door, breathing in the familiar scent of coffee and paper and the lavender air freshener Mrs. Collins, our secretary, used at her desk. Everything was exactly as I'd left it yesterday. My desk with its neat stacks of loan applications, the coffee mug Emma had painted for me last Mother's Day, the small framed photo of Tyler and Emma at the park last summer. "Morning, Erika," called Janet from the teller window. "How was your weekend?" "Good, thanks," I replied automatically, though I could barely remember what I'd done over the weekend. Everything before this morning's phone call felt distant now, like events from someone else's life. I settled at my desk and tried to focus on the loan application in front of me. A young couple wanting to buy their first home, excited about starting their life together. Under normal circumstances, I would have enjoyed helping them navigate the process, explaining options and calculating payments. Today, I read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing any of it. My phone buzzed with a text message from Linda. "Don't forget about this morning. Important." As if I could forget. As if I could think about anything else. At 9:30, I approached Mr. Patterson's office. He was reviewing mortgage documents, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose just like my father's. He looked up when I knocked on his doorframe. "Erika, everything all right?" "I need to take a personal day," I said. "Family emergency." He frowned slightly. "Nothing serious, I hope?" "I'm not sure yet," I answered honestly. "I should know more later today." "Of course, take the time you need. Janet can handle your appointments." I gathered my purse and jacket, trying to ignore the curious looks from my coworkers. Personal emergencies were rare for me. I was the reliable one, the one who came in even when Tyler had a fever or Emma's school called about a skinned knee. Taking an unexpected day off would be noticed, discussed, added to whatever narrative was already forming about my life. The drive to my parents' house took 10 minutes through neighborhoods I'd known since childhood. Past the elementary school, where I'd learned to read, the park where I'd played as a child, the library where I'd spent countless afternoons hiding from the social complexities of adolescence. Everything looked the same, but something felt different, like I was seeing it all through a filter of anxiety and uncertainty. My parents lived on Maple Street in a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a perfectly manicured lawn. Robert had always taken pride in their landscaping, spending weekend mornings trimming hedges and edging sidewalks with military precision. The house looked exactly like what it was, the home of respectable, middle-class Americans who followed rules and maintained appearances. I parked in their driveway behind Linda's silver sedan and sat for a moment, gathering courage. Through the front window, I could see movement in the living room. My parents were waiting for me, probably checking the clock and wondering what was taking so long. I pulled the folder from my purse and checked again that the papers were inside. Those damning documents with my signature at the bottom, acknowledging things I'd never done, admitting to failures that existed only on paper. My stomach churned as I thought about why they might need them now. What new crisis required proof of my supposed inadequacies as a mother? The front door opened before I could knock. Linda stood there in her usual Tuesday outfit, pressed khakis, cardigan sweater, pearl earrings. Her graying hair was perfectly styled, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who'd been getting ready the same way for 40 years. "Thank goodness you're here," she said, ushering me inside quickly. "We have a situation." The living room was exactly as I remembered it from 3 weeks ago. Robert in his leather chair, documents spread across the coffee table. That atmosphere of controlled crisis that my parents seemed to create whenever they needed to manage some aspect of my life. But today felt different. Robert looked older. Somehow, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like fear. And Linda was moving with nervous energy, straightening magazines that didn't need straightening, adjusting curtains that were already perfectly hung. "Sit down, Erika," Robert said, gesturing to the same spot on the couch where I'd signed those papers. "We need to talk." I remained standing, clutching the folder against my chest like armor. "What's going on?" Linda and Robert exchanged a look, one of those married couple communications that happened without words. Then Linda took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "Child Protective Services called this morning. They want to meet with all of us this afternoon." The words hit me like ice water. Child Protective Services. The very thing my parents had warned me about, the nightmare scenario they'd used to convince me to sign those papers. My legs felt weak, and I sank onto the couch without meaning to. "When?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. 2:00, Robert said, consulting his watch. "They're coming here to the house." But why? What triggered this? Even as I asked, I felt a terrible certainty settling in my chest. Mrs. Henderson. It had to be Mrs. Henderson and her grocery. Store observations, finally escalating beyond church gossip into official channels. Linda sat down beside me, her face a mask of concerned sympathy that felt rehearsed. "We're not entirely sure. The caseworker, a Ms. Rodriguez, said they'd received multiple reports about concerning incidents involving you and the children." Multiple reports. The phrase echoed in my head like a bell tolling. Not just Mrs. Henderson, then. Others had been watching, judging, finding fault with my parenting and documenting it somewhere official. "What kind of reports?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Robert cleared his throat and reached for a yellow legal pad covered in his neat handwriting. Ms. Rodriguez mentioned the grocery store incident, of course, but also something about Emma appearing distressed at a school pickup. And apparently someone reported seeing Tyler with what looked like finger-shaped bruises on his upper arm. My blood ran cold. Finger-shaped bruises? When? I've never grabbed Tyler hard enough to leave marks. "We know that, sweetheart," Linda said, patting my knee in a way that felt more condescending than comforting. "But you know how these things can be misinterpreted. Sometimes children bruise easily, and if someone sees marks and doesn't understand the context." "What context?" I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked their perfect front yard. "There is no context because I didn't hurt him. I don't hurt my children." "Of course you don't," Robert said, but his tone suggested patience, with someone who wasn't grasping the severity of the situation. "But that's not the point right now. The point is that CPS is involved, and we need to handle this correctly." I turned back to face them, and for the first time, I really looked at my parents' expressions. Robert appeared worried, yes, but there was something else there. A kind of grim satisfaction, as if a plan was unfolding exactly as he'd expected. Linda kept glancing at the folder in my hands, the one containing those signed papers, with what looked almost like relief. "You knew this was going to happen," I said slowly. You knew when you had me sign those papers that CPS would get involved. We suspected it might, Linda admitted. When Mrs. Henderson started talking to other church members, and then when Sarah Mitchell mentioned seeing Tyler with those marks. Oh, Sarah Mitchell? The name hit me like a slap. Sarah had been my college roommate, someone I'd considered a friend until recently. We'd drifted apart since my divorce, but I never thought she'd be reporting on my parenting to authorities. She was concerned, Robert said. She said Tyler seemed different the last few times she saw him, more withdrawn, less talkative. I thought back to the last time Sarah had visited about 6 weeks ago. Tyler had been going through a phase of shyness around adults, hiding behind my legs and speaking in whispers when guests were over. His teacher had mentioned it was normal for children his age, especially after major life changes like divorce. But apparently, Sarah had interpreted his behavior as a sign of trauma. So you've all been watching me, I said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah, probably others, building a case, collecting incidents, documenting everything I do wrong. It's not like that, Linda protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Then what is it like? I demanded. Because it sounds like a coordinated effort to prove I'm an unfit mother. We're trying to protect you, Robert said firmly. And more importantly, we're trying to protect Emma and Tyler. If there are concerns about your parenting, it's better to address them proactively than to wait for the situation to spiral out of control. By having me confess to things I didn't do? By showing that you're responsible enough to acknowledge when there might be problems and take steps to fix them, he corrected. Those papers you signed demonstrate that you're not in denial about the challenges of single parenting. They show you're willing to get help. I stared at the folder in my hands, understanding finally dawning. You orchestrated this whole thing. The rumors, the reports, all of it. You wanted CPS to investigate me so you could swoop in as the concerned grandparents with proof that I'm already addressing my problems. That's ridiculous, Linda said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Is it? Because this feels awfully convenient. You pressure me into signing papers admitting to abuse, and suddenly CPS shows up wanting to investigate abuse allegations. What did you tell them exactly? Robert and Linda exchanged another one of their wordless communications, and I saw the truth in their guilty silence. You called them, I said, my voice flat with realization. You're the ones who reported me to Child Protective Services. We had to, Linda said quickly. The rumors were spreading, and we knew it was only a matter of time before someone else made an official report. This way, we could control the narrative. Control the narrative, I repeated slowly. By destroying your own daughter's reputation and putting her children at risk of being taken away. We would never let that happen, Robert said. That's why we have those papers. They prove you're taking responsibility and seeking help. With our support and testimony about your character, CPS will see that you're addressing the issues responsibly. The manipulation was breathtaking in its complexity. They'd created a problem, convinced me to provide evidence of my guilt, then positioned themselves as both the solution and my salvation. It was masterful in its cruelty. What if I refuse to go along with this? I asked. What if I tell Ms. Rodriguez that I signed those papers under duress, that none of the allegations are true? Then you'll look like someone who's in denial. About serious parenting issues, Robert said matter-of-factly. Someone who blames others instead of taking responsibility. Is that really the impression you want to give to a CPS caseworker? The trap was perfect. If I maintained my innocence, I'd appear defensive and uncooperative. If I went along with their plan, I'd be admitting to abusing my children. Either way, my credibility as a parent would be damaged. Besides, Linda added, we've already spoken to Ms. Rodriguez about our concerns and our support for you getting help. If you suddenly change your story now, it will look like you're trying to cover something up, You spoke to her already? Just briefly, Robert said, to provide context about the family situation. We explained that you've been struggling. Since the divorce, that single parenting has been challenging for you, but that we're here to support you through this difficult time. I felt sick. They'd painted me as a struggling single mother in crisis, someone whose parents had to step in to protect their grandchildren. It was a narrative that would resonate with a CPS caseworker, especially in a conservative small town, where single motherhood was often viewed with suspicion anyway. What exactly did you tell her? I asked. Linda reached for her own folder, pulling out what looked like typed notes. We explained that you've been under a lot of stress since the divorce, that Mark's absence has been hard on the children, and you've sometimes struggled to manage their behavior appropriately. We mentioned the grocery store incident, Robert continued, but we framed it as you having a difficult day rather than a pattern of abuse. We also talked about how you've recognized that you need help and have already taken steps to address the situation. What steps? I hadn't taken any steps because there were no problems to address. The parenting classes we're going to enroll. You in? Linda said smoothly. And the counseling sessions we've already arranged with Dr. Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton was a family therapist in town, someone my parents knew through their church connections. I'd never spoken to him, never agreed to see him, but apparently my parents had already made arrangements. You've planned everything, I said, feeling the walls closing in around me. My guilt, my redemption, my rehabilitation, all of it mapped out. We've planned your protection, Robert corrected. This way, when Ms. Rodriguez investigates, she'll find a family working together to address problems. You acknowledging issues, us providing support, professional help already in place. It's the best possible outcome. Best for whom? For everyone, Linda said. For you, for the children, for the family's reputation. There it was. The family's reputation. My parents had always cared more about how things looked than how they actually were. Growing up, I'd learned to hide problems rather than solve them, to present a perfect facade even when everything was falling apart inside. I remembered being 12 years old and breaking my wrist while riding my bike. Instead of rushing me to the hospital, my mother had first made me change out of my torn, dirty clothes and brush my hair so we wouldn't look like the kind of family that didn't take proper care of their children. The delay had made the break worse, requiring surgery that might have been avoided with immediate treatment. But we'd looked respectable walking into the emergency room, and that was what mattered. Now they were doing the same thing with my parenting. Creating a controlled crisis they could manage, rather than trusting that the truth would be sufficient. What happens to Emma and Tyler during all this? I asked. While you're managing my reputation and orchestrating my rehabilitation? They'll be fine, Linda assured me. If CPS determines that temporary placement is necessary while you complete your programs, they can stay here with us. We're already approved emergency caregivers. The casual way she said it made my blood freeze. You're already approved? When did that happen? We applied several weeks ago, Robert said. Just as a precaution. We thought it would be good to have options in place, in case the situation escalated. Several weeks ago, right around the time they'd pressured me into signing those papers. They'd been planning this entire scenario for weeks, possibly months. Every move calculated, every contingency planned. You want to take my children away? I said, the truth finally becoming clear. We want to keep them safe, Linda corrected. And keep them in the family while you get the help you need. I don't need help because I haven't done anything wrong. Erika. Robert's voice carried that familiar note of disappointed patience that had followed me through childhood. This kind of denial is exactly what concerns us. You signed papers acknowledging that your discipline methods have been problematic, but now you're acting like nothing happened. Because nothing did happen. You manipulated me into signing those papers by threatening me with exactly this scenario. No one forced you to sign anything, Linda said. You made a mature decision to take responsibility for your actions. The gaslighting was expert level, the kind that made me question my own memory and perception. Had I been wrong to sign those papers? Had I actually been struggling more than I'd realized? Were there problems with my parenting that I was too blind or too proud to see? But then I thought about Emma's trusting smile that morning, about Tyler's enthusiastic recitation of spelling words, about the way both children came to me for comfort when they were hurt or scared. These weren't the behaviors of children who feared their mother or had been traumatized by abuse. I want to see the reports, I said. The ones CPS received. I want to know exactly what people have been saying about me. That's not how it works, Robert said. CPS doesn't share the details of reports with the subjects of investigation. But they'll share them with concerned grandparents? They shared enough for us to understand the situation, he replied evasively. I realized then that I might never know the full extent of what had been reported or who had made the reports. In a small town, rumors spread like wildfire, and once people started looking for problems, they found them everywhere. A raised voice in the parking lot became verbal abuse. A firm grip on a child's hand became physical force. Normal parenting moments, viewed through a lens of suspicion, could be transformed into evidence of maltreatment. What time do Emma and Tyler get out of school? I asked suddenly. 3:15, Linda answered. Why? Because they should be here when Ms. Rodriguez arrives. If this investigation is really about their welfare, they should have a voice in it. Absolutely not, Robert said firmly. Children shouldn't be exposed to these kinds of proceedings. It's traumatic for them. More traumatic than being removed from their home based on false allegations? The allegations aren't false if you signed papers confirming them, Linda pointed out. We were going in circles and I was running out of time. The meeting with CPS was in less than 3 hours, and I still didn't understand the full scope of what I was facing. But one thing was becoming clear. My parents weren't trying to protect me or my children. They were trying to control us. I thought back to my childhood, to the pattern of their parenting that I'd somehow forgotten in the years since moving out. They'd always been controllers, people who believed they knew what was best for everyone around them and weren't shy about manipulating situations to achieve their desired outcomes. When I was 16, I'd wanted to attend a summer art camp at the state university. I'd worked all year to save money for the program, had my application ready, was excited about the opportunity to develop my drawing skills. But my parents had decided that camp was a waste of time and money, that I should spend the summer working at my father's friend's insurance office instead. They hadn't simply said no. Instead, they'd orchestrated a campaign to make me believe the art camp was a bad idea. They'd found problems with the dormitory arrangements, questioned the quality of the instruction, worried aloud about the other students I might meet there. They'd presented their concerns as loving protection, not control. At the same time, they'd talked up the benefits of the insurance job. Practical experience, they'd said, real-world skills, the kind of opportunity that would look good on college applications. They'd made it sound like I was lucky to have the option, like choosing art camp over office work would be foolish and immature. In the end, I'd withdrawn my application and spent the summer filing papers and answering phones. I'd told myself it was my decision, that I'd realized the camp wasn't right for me. It had taken years to understand that I'd been manipulated into giving up something I wanted for something they preferred. Now they were doing the same thing with my children, except the stakes were infinitely higher. Instead of a summer program, they were threatening my parental rights. Instead of career guidance, they were orchestrating a child welfare investigation. I need to use your bathroom, I said, standing up abruptly. Of course, Linda said. You know where it is. I walked down the familiar hallway, past family photos that showed a sanitized version of our history. Me at high school graduation, smiling but tense. My wedding day, where I'd looked beautiful but somehow fragile. Emma and Tyler as babies, held by their grandmother in pictures that emphasized her role in their lives. What the photos didn't show were the arguments, the criticism, the constant subtle undermining of my confidence and independence. They didn't capture my mother's tendency to question every decision I made, or my father's habit of offering advice that felt more like orders. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked older than my 32 years, worn down by 2 years of single parenting and a lifetime of trying to please people who were never satisfied. But I also looked like someone who loved her children, someone who would fight for them when it mattered. And this mattered more than anything ever had. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found David Chen's number. David was a lawyer I'd met through work, someone who handled family law cases and had a reputation for being both smart and honest. We'd never spoken outside of professional contexts, but I remembered him mentioning that he'd grown up in a controlling family and understood how difficult it could be to break free from toxic patterns. I typed a quick text. Need urgent legal advice regarding CPS investigation. Can you talk today? His response came back within minutes. Can meet at 5 p.m. at my office. Bring any relevant documents. I deleted the text thread and put my phone away, feeling the first spark of hope I'd had all day. Maybe I was trapped, but I wasn't helpless. Maybe my parents had orchestrated this situation, but that didn't mean they controlled the outcome. When I returned to the living room, Robert and Linda were huddled together, speaking in low voices that stopped when they saw me. Everything all right? Linda asked with false brightness. Fine, I said. Just needed a moment to think. And, what are you thinking? Robert asked. I looked at both of them. These people who'd raised me but never really known me, who claimed to love me but consistently undermined me, who said they were protecting my children while actively working to take them away from me. I'm thinking that we should get our stories straight before Ms. Rodriguez arrives, I said carefully. If we're all going to present a united front about me getting help, we need to make sure our version of events is consistent. Relief washed over their faces. They thought I was capitulating, accepting their narrative, agreeing to play the role they'd written for me. That's very mature, Erika, Robert said approvingly. Yes, Linda agreed. It's important that Ms. Rodriguez sees we're all working together for the children's benefit. I nodded and sat back down, opening the folder containing those damning papers. Let's go through exactly what we're going to tell her. For the I. Next hour, we rehearsed our performance. I played the part of the struggling single mother who'd recognized her mistakes and was grateful for her parents' support. They played the concerned grandparents who'd noticed troubling signs, but were confident their daughter could overcome her challenges with proper help. It felt like preparing for a play where everyone knew their lines, except the audience. And the audience, in this case, was a CPS caseworker who would decide whether my children stayed with me or were placed in foster care while I completed programs to address problems I'd never had. But as we talked, I was also listening, cataloging every detail of their plan, every assumption they'd made, every lie they'd told or were preparing to tell. Because if David Chen was half as good as his reputation suggested, I was going to need ammunition for the fight of my life. At exactly 2 o'clock, a silver Honda Civic pulled into the driveway. Through the front window, I watched a middle-aged Latina woman in a business suit gather a briefcase and manila folders from her passenger seat. Ms. Rodriguez looked professional, competent, and utterly unaware that she was walking into a carefully orchestrated family drama. Showtime, Robert murmured, straightening his tie. Linda smoothed her skirt and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. Remember, we're all on the same team here. We all want what's best for Emma and Tyler. I clutched the folder of false confessions against my chest and walked toward the door, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether I kept my children or lost them to my parents' twisted version of protection. But I also knew something. My parents didn't. I wasn't the same person who'd signed those papers 3 weeks ago. I wasn't the frightened, isolated single mother they thought they were manipulating. I was someone who'd finally seen through their games, and I was done playing by their rules. Ms. Rodriguez had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but her expression was all business as Linda ushered her into the living room. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with graying black hair pulled back in a neat bun and a no-nonsense manner that immediately commanded respect. "Thank you for meeting with me today," she said, settling into the chair across from our couch and pulling out a digital recorder. "I hope you don't mind if I record our conversation for accuracy." "Of course not," Robert replied smoothly. "We want to be as helpful as possible." Ms. Rodriguez opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick file folder. "I've received several reports of concern regarding the welfare of Emma and Tyler Morrison. The allegations include inappropriate physical discipline, verbal aggression, and possible neglect. I'm here to assess the situation and determine what support the family might need." My throat felt dry as sandpaper. Hearing the accusations spoken aloud by an official made them sound more real, more threatening. Even knowing they were false, I felt the weight of judgment settling over me like a heavy blanket. "We're so glad you're here," Linda said, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. "We've been concerned about Erika's adjustment to single parenting. It's been a difficult transition for everyone." "Mrs. Morrison," Ms. Rodriguez turned to me, "can you tell me about your current living situation? I understand you're divorced and have primary custody of the children." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, Mark and I divorced 2 years ago. The children live with me full-time. He has visitation every other weekend, though he doesn't always exercise it." "And how has that arrangement been working for the family?" This was the moment. I could follow my parents' script, play the struggling single mother who'd lost control and needed help. Or I could tell the truth and risk looking defensive and uncooperative. "It's been challenging at times," I said carefully. "But we've managed well. The children are happy, healthy, and doing well in school." Ms. Rodriguez made notes on her tablet. "I'd like to discuss some specific incidents that have been reported. There was an incident at Kroger grocery store involving your son Tyler. Can you tell me about that?" My heart hammered against my ribs. Tyler had a meltdown in the cereal aisle because I wouldn't buy sugary cereal. He threw himself on the floor and started screaming. I tried to calm him down, and when that didn't work, I carried him to the car. "And how did you carry him?" "I picked him up under his arms and carried him out. He was kicking and screaming the whole time." "Did you grab his arms forcefully?" I thought back to that embarrassing afternoon, remembering the weight of Tyler's body as he fought against me, the stares of other shoppers, the heat of shame on my face. I held him firmly enough to keep him safe, but I didn't hurt him. "Several witnesses reported that you appeared angry, and that Tyler seemed frightened." I was frustrated, yes, but Tyler wasn't frightened of me. He was having a tantrum because he didn't get what he wanted. It's normal 8-year-old behavior. Ms. Rodriguez nodded neutrally and made more notes. "There's also a report about Emma appearing distressed when you picked her up late from school." I was stuck at work with a difficult case. Traffic was heavy. Emma was tired because it was Friday afternoon and she'd had a long week. She fell asleep in the car on the way home. The teacher reported that Emma seemed withdrawn and wouldn't talk about why she was upset. Because she wasn't upset about anything serious. She was tired and disappointed that she was the last child picked up. Any 6-year-old would feel that way. I could see my parents exchanging glances in my peripheral vision. This wasn't going according to their plan. I was supposed to be more contrite, more willing to acknowledge problems. "Mrs. Morrison," Ms. Rodriguez continued, "there's also a report of bruising on Tyler's upper arms that appeared consistent with grip marks." This was the allegation that terrified me most. Physical evidence, or what someone had interpreted as physical evidence. "I don't know what bruises you're referring to. Tyler is an active child. He plays rough with other kids, he climbs trees, He's always bumping into things. The report suggests these particular marks were finger-shaped and located in a pattern, consistent with an adult gripping a child's arms. I don't grab my children hard enough to leave bruises, I said firmly. If Tyler had marks on his arms, they came from playing or from an accident. When was the last time you used physical discipline with either child? The question hung in the air like a trap. Any admission of physical discipline could be twisted into evidence of abuse, but denying it entirely might make me look dishonest. I don't hit my children, I said. Occasionally, I might guide them physically, like steering Tyler away from danger or helping Emma out of a situation where she's stuck, but I don't use physical punishment. Ms. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, reviewing her notes. Then she looked directly at me with those penetrating dark eyes. Mrs. Morrison, I understand you've recently acknowledged some concerns about your parenting methods. Can you tell me about that? This was it, the moment my parents had been waiting for, the reason they'd pressured me into signing those papers. They expected me to pull out the folder and hand over my signed confession, cementing their narrative of a struggling mother who'd recognized her problems and was seeking help. Instead, I found myself saying, I'm not sure what you're referring to. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel my parents' shock radiating from across the room like heat from a furnace. Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ms. Rodriguez, he interjected, perhaps I should clarify. Erika has been struggling with the stress of single parenting, and we've been working together as a family to address some concerning patterns. What kind of patterns? Ms. Rodriguez asked, turning her attention to my father. Incidents where Erika's frustration has led to inappropriate responses, Linda said, jumping in smoothly. Nothing malicious, of course, just a young mother, overwhelmed by circumstances and sometimes reacting poorly to challenging behavior. And Mrs. Morrison has acknowledged these concerns? My parents looked at me expectantly. The folder sat in my lap like a loaded weapon, waiting to be deployed. All I had to do was open it, hand over those signed papers, and follow the script. They'd written for my redemption. But something had shifted in me during the past hour of watching this performance. Maybe it was the clinical way Ms. Rodriguez discussed my alleged failures as a mother. Maybe it was the practiced ease with which my parents played their roles as concerned grandparents. Maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of 32 years of being told I was wrong about my own experiences. I think there may be some misunderstanding, I said slowly. I haven't acknowledged any concerning patterns because I don't believe there are any concerning patterns to acknowledge. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Robert's face flushed red, and Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Erika, Robert said in a warning tone, perhaps you're feeling defensive because of the stress of this meeting. I'm not feeling defensive, I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. I'm feeling confused about why we're here discussing allegations that don't match my experience of my own life. Ms. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, studying, the dynamics playing out in front of her with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen family dysfunction in all its forms. Mrs. Morrison, your parents contacted our office to express concerns about your parenting. They indicated that you had recognized some problems and were seeking help. They contacted your office? I turned to look at my parents directly. You called CPS on me? We called because we were concerned, Linda said defensively. Other people were talking, making reports. We thought it was better to get ahead of the situation. What other people? What reports? Mrs. Henderson from church mentioned the grocery store incident, Robert said. And Sarah Mitchell expressed concerns about Tyler's behavior. So you decided to call Child Protective Services based on church gossip and one friend's opinion? We decided to seek professional help for a family in crisis, Linda corrected, her voice taking on that self-righteous tone I remembered from childhood arguments. Ms. Rodriguez held up a hand to stop the escalating tension. Let me clarify something, Mrs. Morrison, your parents weren't the only ones who contacted our office. We received 3 separate reports over the past month. From whom? I can't share the identities of reporters, but I can tell you that the concerns were consistent across multiple sources. I felt a chill of understanding. 3 reports. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah Mitchell, and who else? You? I looked at my parents accusingly. We were the 3rd report, Robert admitted, but only after the other concerns had been raised. We felt we needed to provide context. The betrayal was stunning in its completeness. Not only had my parents orchestrated this investigation, they'd convinced others to participate in building a case against me. They'd turned my small-town community into a surveillance network, encouraging people to view my parenting through a lens of suspicion and report anything that could be construed as problematic. What kind of context did you provide? I asked. We explained that you'd been struggling since the divorce, Linda said. That you'd been under stress and sometimes had difficulty managing the children's behavior appropriately. And we mentioned that you'd already recognized the need for help, Robert added. Ms. Rodriguez looked between us with growing interest. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, you indicated in your report that Erika had acknowledged problems with her parenting methods. Do you have documentation of that acknowledgement? This was their moment, the climax of their elaborate plan. They expected me to produce the signed papers that would validate their story and demonstrate my cooperation with their intervention. But I didn't move. I sat perfectly still, the folder unopened in my lap, and watched my parents realize that their plan was falling apart. Well, Robert stammered. She signed some documents acknowledging that her discipline methods might need adjustment. May I see those documents? Ms. Rodriguez asked. All eyes turned to me. The folder seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Inside were papers that could either save me or destroy me, depending on how they were interpreted. Papers I'd signed under duress, believing I was protecting my children from the exact scenario that was now unfolding. I'm not sure those documents accurately represent the situation, I said finally. What do you mean? Ms. Rodriguez asked. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I said next would determine the course of everything that followed. I mean that I signed those papers because my parents told me that if I didn't, CPS would investigate me and potentially remove my children. They presented it as a way to get ahead of false allegations and show that I was being responsible about addressing concerns. So the documents exist, but you're saying you signed them under pressure? Yes. They told me that people were already talking, that rumors were spreading, and that signing the papers would demonstrate my willingness to take responsibility and get help. They said it would protect me if anyone made official reports. But the problems acknowledged in the documents, do those reflect real issues with your parenting? No. They reflect my parents' interpretation of normal parenting challenges. A child having a tantrum became evidence of my inability to manage behavior. A child being tired after a long day became a sign of trauma. Normal childhood bruises became evidence of physical abuse. Ms. Rodriguez turned to my parents. Is this accurate? Did you pressure Mrs. Morrison to sign documents acknowledging parenting problems she says didn't exist? We encouraged her to be honest about her struggles, Linda said carefully. Single parenting is difficult, and Erika has always had trouble admitting when she needs help. The documents in question, were they prepared before or after the incidents that prompted the CPS reports? Robert shifted uncomfortably. They were prepared as a precautionary measure, in case the situation escalated. So you had your daughter sign papers admitting to problematic parenting before any official complaints were filed? We were trying to be proactive, he insisted. And then you contacted CPS yourselves to report concerns about her parenting? We felt we had a responsibility to protect our grandchildren. Ms. Rodriguez set down her pen and studied my parents with a new intensity. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, help me understand this sequence of events. You became concerned about your daughter's parenting. convinced her to sign documents acknowledging problems, then reported her to Child Protective Services for the same problems she'd already acknowledged? When she put it that way, the manipulation was obvious even to someone hearing the story for the first time. My parents had essentially created evidence of my guilt, then used that evidence to justify reporting me to authorities. It wasn't like that, Linda protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Then how was it? Robert tried to regain control of the narrative. We were concerned about patterns we'd observed. We encouraged Erika to seek help voluntarily. When she seemed resistant to getting the support she needed, we felt we had no choice but to involve professionals. But Mrs. Morrison says she never believed there were problems that required professional intervention. Erika has always had difficulty with self-awareness, Linda said, that familiar condescending tone creeping into her voice. She tends to minimize problems rather than address them directly. Or, I said, finding my voice again, I tend to trust my own judgment about my own life rather than accept other people's interpretations of my experiences. Ms. Rodriguez made several notes, then looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mrs. Morrison, do you have those documents with you? I nodded, patting the folder. May I see them? This was the moment of truth. I could hand over the papers and try to explain the context, hoping Ms. Rodriguez would understand the coercion involved. Or I could refuse and risk looking uncooperative and secretive. I opened the folder and withdrew the signed documents, my hands trembling slightly as I passed them across the coffee table. Ms. Rodriguez read them carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. These are quite detailed, she said finally. They acknowledge specific incidents of physical discipline that exceeded appropriate bounds, verbal aggression toward the children, and a pattern of losing control during stressful situations. None of which actually happened, I said. I signed those papers because I was told that refusing would make me look defensive and uncooperative if CPS got involved. I was told that having documentation of my willingness to address concerns would protect me and my children. Instead of which, the documentation has been used as evidence to support a CPS investigation. Exactly. Ms. Rodriguez set the papers aside and looked at my parents again. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, did you prepare these documents? Our attorney helped with the language, Robert admitted. Your attorney prepared documents for your daughter to sign admitting to child abuse? Not abuse, Linda said quickly. Inappropriate discipline. There's a difference. Is there? Because these documents describe behavior that could certainly be characterized as abusive. The room fell silent except for the ticking of my mother's antique mantel clock. I could see my parents beginning to realize that their carefully constructed plan was backfiring. Instead of presenting them as concerned grandparents supporting a struggling daughter, their story was making them look like manipulative orchestrators of a family crisis. Ms. Rodriguez, I said, may I ask what typically happens in cases where family members make false reports to CPS? False reports are taken very seriously, she replied. They waste resources, traumatize families, and can be considered a form of harassment or manipulation. And what about cases where grandparents attempt to gain custody of children by manufacturing evidence against the parents? My parents both started talking at once, denying any custody motivations, insisting they only wanted what was best for Emma and Tyler. But Ms. Rodriguez held up her hand for silence. Let me ask this directly, she said. Have you discussed potential custody arrangements for Emma and Tyler if Mrs. Morrison were deemed unfit to care for them? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Robert and Linda looked at each other, and I saw the truth in their hesitation. We've naturally considered what would be best for the children if Erika needed time to address her issues, Linda said carefully. What kind of time? However long it might take for her to complete parenting programs and demonstrate improved coping skills. And during that time, The children would live with you? We're already approved emergency caregivers, Robert said. We applied for that status several weeks ago, just as a precaution. Ms. Rodriguez made another note. You applied to become emergency caregivers before any official CPS reports were filed? We wanted to be prepared in case the situation deteriorated. Or in case the situation you were orchestrating came to fruition, I said, finally understanding the full scope of their plan. They'd set everything up in advance, convinced people to make reports about my parenting, pressured me into signing confessions, applied to become emergency caregivers, called CPS themselves to trigger an investigation. All so they could swoop in as the solution to a crisis they'd created. Ms. Rodriguez closed her folder and turned off her recorder. I think I have enough information for now. Mrs. Morrison, I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting with you and the children. I'd also like to conduct some home visits to observe you with Emma and Tyler in your normal environment. Of course, I said, relief flooding through me. She wasn't recommending immediate removal of the children. She was going to investigate further, which meant I had time to present my side of the story. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, she continued, I may have additional questions for you as this investigation proceeds. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you'd refrain from any further involvement in this case. What do you mean? Linda asked. I mean no more reports, no more documentation, no more interventions. Let me do my job without additional complications. After Ms. Rodriguez left, the three of us sat in uncomfortable silence for several long minutes. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. Erika, I hope you understand that everything we've done has been motivated by love and concern for you and the children. Has it? I asked. Because from where I sit, it looks like everything you've done has been motivated by a desire to control me and take custody of my children. That's not fair, Linda protested. We've always supported you. You've always undermined me, I corrected. You've spent my entire adult life convincing me that I can't trust my own judgment, that I need your guidance to navigate the world successfully. And when I finally started building a life independent of your influence, you decided to destroy us? We're trying to protect Emma and Tyler, Robert insisted. From what? From a mother who loves them, provides for them, keeps them safe and happy? Or from a life where they're not under your direct control? You're being dramatic, Linda said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. Am I? Because it seems to me that you've just spent the last hour trying to convince a CPS caseworker that I'm an unfit mother based on fabricated evidence and false reports. If that's not dramatic, I don't know what is. I stood up, gathering my purse and the folder of signed papers. I'm going to pick up Emma and Tyler from school now, and then I'm going home to my apartment where we live happily without constant criticism and manipulation. Erika, wait, Linda called after me. We need to discuss what happens next. What happens next is that I defend myself and my children against the false accusations you've orchestrated. What happens next is that I stop pretending we're a normal, loving family when we're actually a group of people where two members are actively trying to destroy the third. You can't mean that, Robert said, looking genuinely shocked. I can and I do. You've shown me exactly who you are and what you're willing to do to get what you want. I'm finally ready to believe you. I walked toward the door, feeling lighter with each step despite the crisis still ahead of me. Behind me, I could hear my parents starting to argue with each other, their united front crumbling now that their plan had failed to achieve its intended result. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warm on my face as I walked to my car. I had a meeting with David Chen in an hour, and for the first time all day, I felt hopeful about the outcome. Ms. Rodriguez had seen through my parents' manipulation. She'd recognized the manufactured nature of the crisis and was investigating accordingly. But I also knew this was just the beginning. My parents weren't going to give up easily, and they had weeks of preparation and community support behind them. The fight for my children was far from over. As I drove toward the elementary school to pick up Emma and Tyler, I allowed myself to imagine a future where we were free from my parents' influence entirely, where I could parent my children without constant scrutiny and second-guessing, where normal childhood moments weren't interpreted as evidence of trauma or abuse. It seemed almost too good to hope for, but for the first time in years, I was ready to fight for it. David Chen's law office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house on Oak Street, just 3 blocks from the courthouse. The waiting room was small but comfortable, with soft lighting and family law books lining the shelves. I arrived 10 minutes early, clutching the folder of signed papers and a hastily written timeline of events that I'd scribbled during lunch. Emma and Tyler were safely at my neighbor Rachel's apartment. Rachel was a retired teacher who lived 2 doors down from us, and she'd become something of a surrogate grandmother to my children over the past year. When I'd called her in a panic after leaving my parents' house, she'd immediately offered to watch the kids for the evening. "Whatever you need, honey," she'd said in her warm southern drawl. "Those babies are lucky to have you fighting for them." It was the first genuinely supportive words I'd heard all day, and they'd nearly brought me to tears. David emerged from his inner office at exactly 5 o'clock, just as I'd expected. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with graying temples and kind eyes behind trendy glasses. We'd worked together on several loan applications where clients had needed legal documentation, and I'd always been impressed by his thoroughness and integrity. "Erika," he said, extending his hand warmly. "Thank you for coming. I have to say, your text message intrigued me. CPS investigations aren't usually this urgent unless children have been removed from the home." "They haven't been," I said quickly, "at least not yet. But my parents are trying to orchestrate exactly that outcome." He raised an eyebrows and gestured me into his office. The space was neat and organized, with law degrees and family photos creating a professional but personal atmosphere. He offered me coffee, which I declined, then settled behind his desk with a legal pad. "Tell me everything," he said simply. For the next 45 minutes, I laid out the entire story. The grocery store incident and school pickup that had been twisted into evidence of abuse, the reports made by Mrs. Henderson and Sarah Mitchell, my parents' pressure campaign to get me to sign the admission papers, the revelation that they'd been the ones to call CPS in the first place, the discovery that they'd applied to become emergency caregivers weeks before any investigation began. David listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification on dates and details. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers, studying me with those analytical lawyer eyes. "This is one of the most calculated manipulation schemes I've encountered in family law," he said finally. "And I've seen some doozies. Your parents essentially manufactured a crisis, created evidence to support it, then positioned themselves as the solution. Can they actually get custody this way?" "Not if we handle this correctly," he said. "But I need to understand something first. Why did you sign those papers? Even under pressure, admitting to child abuse in writing is an extraordinary step." I'd been dreading this question, knowing how my decision would sound to an objective observer. I was terrified. My parents made it sound like CPS involvement was inevitable, and that having documentation of my willingness to address problems would protect me. They painted a picture of what would happen if I appeared defensive or uncooperative. "And you believed them?" "I believed them because they've spent my entire life convincing me that they know better than I do about everything. They have a way of making me doubt my own perceptions and judgment." David nodded with recognition. "Gaslighting. It's a common technique in controlling families. The victim becomes so accustomed to having their reality questioned that they lose confidence in their own experiences." "Exactly." When they told me I was struggling with anger management, part of me wondered if they were right. When they said other people were concerned about my parenting, I started second-guessing every interaction I'd had with my children. But you don't actually believe you have anger management issues or parenting problems? No. I'm not a perfect mother, but I'm a good one. My children are well cared for, happy, and healthy. They're not afraid of me. They don't show signs of trauma. And they come to me for comfort when they're hurt or scared. Good. That confidence is going to be crucial in the days ahead. David pulled out a fresh legal pad and started writing. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to file a motion to have the CPS investigation transferred to a different caseworker. Ms. Rodriguez seems fair-minded, but given the complexity of the family dynamics, we want someone who comes in with completely fresh eyes. Is that possible? In cases where there are questions about the motivations behind the reports, yes, especially when family members are both the reporters and potential beneficiaries of custody changes. What else? We're going to document everything. I want you to write down every interaction you've had with your parents regarding this situation. Every phone call, every conversation, every pressure tactic they used. Include dates, times, and exact quotes wherever possible. I pulled out my phone and showed him the notes I'd already started. I began this afternoon during the CPS meeting. I wrote down everything I could remember about how they convinced me to sign those papers. Excellent. Keep going. The more detail, the better. He made another note. We're also going to request copies of all the reports made to CPS. They won't give us the names of reporters, but they'll provide the content of the reports. I suspect we'll find inconsistencies and exaggerations that support your version of events. What about those papers I signed? Are they going to destroy my case? David leaned forward, his expression serious but reassuring. They're problematic, but they're not fatal. The circumstances under which you signed them matter enormously. Coercion invalidates consent, even in civil matters. And the fact that your parents prepared the documents before any reports were filed actually works in our favor. How so? Because it shows premeditation. They didn't draft those papers in response to concerns that arose organically. They created them as part of a deliberate strategy to build a case against you. But will CPS see it that way? With proper representation, yes. CPS caseworkers are trained to recognize family manipulation tactics. The pattern here is textbook parental alienation, with the added twist that it's grandparents attempting to alienate you from your own children. What happens if they don't see it that way? What if they decide the papers are legitimate evidence of my unfitness as a parent? David's expression grew somber. Then we fight it in family court. But I don't think it will come to that. Based on your description of today's meeting, Ms. Rodriguez was already questioning your parents' motivations. She seemed suspicious of them by the end. Good. That suggests she's doing her job properly. David flipped to a new page on his legal pad. Now, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Have you ever hit your children? No. Ever grabbed them forcefully enough to leave marks? No. Ever spoken to them in a way that could be characterized as verbally abusive? I've raised my voice when they were in danger or not listening about important safety issues. But no, I don't yell at them or call them names or threaten them. Good. What about your ex-husband? Could he be involved in this somehow? I considered the question. Mark and I had divorced amicably enough, and he'd never expressed concerns about my parenting. If anything, he'd been grateful that I was willing to handle most of the child care responsibilities so he could focus on his career. I don't think so. Mark sees the kids every other weekend, and he's never mentioned any problems. He's actually complimented me on how well-adjusted they are. When did you last speak with him? 2 weeks ago when he picked up the kids for his weekend. Everything was normal. I'm going to reach out to him anyway, David said. If your parents are building a case, they might have approached him for support. I want to make sure he's not planning to testify against you. The thought hadn't occurred to me, but it made my stomach clench with new anxiety. Mark had always gotten along well with my parents. They'd been disappointed about the divorce but had maintained a relationship with him. What if they'd convinced him that I was really struggling? What if they'd shown him those signed papers and persuaded him that intervention was necessary? You think he'd side with them? I think desperate people do desperate things. And if your parents are as committed to this plan as they appear to be, they'll explore every possible avenue of support. Mark loves Emma and Tyler. He wouldn't do anything that would hurt them. Let's hope not, but we need to be prepared for all possibilities. David made another note. What about other family members? Siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins who might be pulled into this? My parents don't have other children. My father has a brother in California, but they barely speak. My mother has a sister in Florida, but she's in poor health and wouldn't get involved. Friends who might support your parents' version of events? Mrs. Henderson from church, obviously. Maybe some of their other church friends who only know what my parents have told them. I thought about the social circles my parents moved in, the bridge club and book club and volunteer committees where reputation and gossip mattered so much. But honestly, most people in town know me independently. I grew up here, went to school with their children, worked with them over the years. I don't think they'd believe I'm an abusive mother without solid evidence. And the evidence your parents have manufactured may not hold up under scrutiny, David said. Especially if we can demonstrate the coordinated nature of their campaign. What do you mean? I mean that if Mrs. Henderson and Sarah Mitchell were approached by your parents and encouraged to make reports, their observations might be less credible than they appear. People see what they're told to look for, especially when someone they respect is guiding their interpretation. You think my parents coached them on what to report? I think it's possible. At minimum, they probably shared their concerns with these women and asked them to keep an eye on you. That kind of priming can turn normal parenting moments into suspicious incidents. David spent the next 20 minutes outlining our strategy. He would file motions challenging the investigation and requesting full documentation. He would interview Mark and any other potential witnesses. He would work with me to prepare a comprehensive defense that included character references from teachers, employers, neighbors, and family friends. How long will all this take? I asked. CPS investigations typically take 30 to 60 days, depending on complexity. Given the disputed nature of the allegations, this one might take longer. But that actually works in our favor. The more time we have to build our case, the better. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you document everything. Every interaction with your children, every conversation with your parents, every development in the case. You also live your life normally. Don't change your parenting style. Don't avoid public situations. Don't act like someone who has something to hide. What if my parents escalate? What if they make more reports or try to create new incidents? Then they'll look increasingly desperate and vindictive. CPS caseworkers know the difference between genuine concern and manipulation. The more your parents push, the more obvious their agenda becomes. David walked me to the door, and we scheduled a follow-up meeting for the end of the week. As I drove home through the darkening streets of Millfield, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that I had competent legal representation, anxiety about the fight ahead, anger at my parents for putting my family through this ordeal, and underneath it all, a growing sense of determination that surprised me with its intensity. For too many years, I'd accepted my parents' version of who I was and what I was capable of. I'd let them convince me that I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too naive to navigate the world without their guidance. Even as an adult with my own children and career, I'd continued to seek their approval and defer to their judgment. But this was different. This was about Emma and Tyler, about their safety and well-being and future. And whatever doubts I might have about myself, I had no doubts about my love for my children or my ability to care for them. When I arrived at Rachel's apartment, I could hear laughter from the kitchen. Emma and Tyler were sitting at her small dining table, finishing bowls of homemade chicken soup while Rachel told them stories about her teaching days. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, that I felt tears prick at my eyes. "Mommy!" Emma jumped up and ran to hug me. "Miss Rachel made us soup and grilled cheese, and she has a cat named Mr. Whiskers who likes to sit on my lap." Tyler grinned from his seat at the table. "She taught third grade for like 100 years, Mom. She knows all the good games." 43 years, young man," Rachel corrected with mock indignation. "And some of us are still young at heart. Thank you very much." I hugged my children close, breathing in the familiar scent of their shampoo and feeling the solid warmth of their small bodies against mine. These were healthy, happy children who trusted me completely. Whatever else was uncertain in my life, that was not. "How did everything go?" Rachel asked quietly, while Emma and Tyler returned to their soup. "Better than expected," I said. "I have a good lawyer, and I think the CPS caseworker is starting to see through my parents' manipulation." "Good. I've been thinking about this situation all afternoon, and I want you to know that I'm prepared to testify on your behalf if needed. Rachel, you don't have to get involved in family drama. Honey, this isn't drama. This is an attack on a good mother by people who should be supporting her. I've been watching you with these children for over a year, and I've never seen anything but patience, love, and good judgment." "Thank you," I said, feeling emotional again. "That means more than you know. I've also been thinking about other people who could speak to your character as a mother. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, thinks the world of you. Tyler's coach from Little League has always complimented you on how well-behaved and respectful he is. Dr. Williams at the pediatric clinic has never expressed any concerns about the children's well-being. You've really thought this through." "I have, and I want you to know that you have support in this community. Your parents may have influence, but they don't have a monopoly on public opinion." As we walked back to our apartment, Emma chattering about Mr. Whiskers and Tyler practicing his spelling words out loud, I realized that Rachel was right. I did have support. I just hadn't been looking for it in the right places. I'd been so focused on winning my parents' approval that I'd overlooked the relationships with people who already valued and respected me. That evening, after Emma and Tyler were in bed, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began writing down everything I could remember about the past month. The conversations with my parents about the signed papers, the pressure tactics they'd used, the timeline of events that led to the CPS investigation. As I wrote, patterns emerged that I hadn't noticed while living through the experience. My parents had been remarkably well prepared for every stage of this process. They'd had answers, ready for my questions, documents prepared for my signature, backup plans for every contingency. This wasn't a spontaneous response to genuine concerns about my parenting. This was a campaign, planned and executed with military precision. The more I documented, the angrier I became. Not just at their manipulation, but at my own willingness to be manipulated. How had I allowed them to convince me that I was the problem? How had I signed papers admitting to abuse I'd never committed? How had I trusted their judgment over my own so completely? But anger was useful now. It was fuel for the fight ahead, motivation to protect my children from people who would use them as pawns in their control games. I thought about Emma's trusting smile and Tyler's easy laughter, about the life we'd built together that was honest and loving and real. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, I worried it might be more pressure from my parents or another complication in an already complex situation. But when I opened it, I saw David Chen's name. "Spoke with your ex-husband this evening. He's supportive of you and surprised by the allegations. He's willing to provide character testimony if needed. That's one less thing to worry about." I felt a massive wave of relief. Mark might not have been the ideal husband, but he was a decent man who genuinely cared about Emma and Tyler. Having his support would strengthen my position considerably. I was about to put the phone away when it buzzed again, this time with my father's number. "Erika, we need to talk. This situation has gotten out of hand. Please call me." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. For 32 years, I'd jumped whenever my parents summoned me. I'd dropped everything to meet their needs, answer their questions, address their concerns. But those days were over. From now on, they would have to deal with the consequences of their choices just like everyone else. And if they wanted to talk to me, they could do it through my attorney. I turned off my phone and returned to my legal pad, filling page after page with documentation of their manipulation. Tomorrow, I would call Emma's teacher and Tyler's coach, and Dr. Williams. I would ask Rachel to help me compile a list of character witnesses. I would begin building the case that would prove I was exactly the mother I'd always known myself to be. Outside my kitchen window, Millfield slept peacefully under a canopy of stars. Somewhere across town, my parents were probably plotting their next move, trying to figure out how to salvage their plan now that I'd refused to play my assigned role. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I wasn't worried about what they might do next. I was too busy planning my own next moves. And I had the advantage they'd never expected. The truth was on my side, and I was finally ready to fight for it. The legal pad filled up as the night wore on, and with each page I felt stronger, more certain, more determined to protect the life Emma, Tyler, and I had built together. My parents had started this war, but I was going to finish it. And when I did, my children would never again have to worry about being used as weapons in someone else's campaign for control. 3 weeks later, I stood in the hallway outside the family court building, watching my parents emerge from the elevator with their attorney. Robert looked older than I'd ever seen him, his usually confident posture replaced by something that resembled defeat. Linda clutched her purse like a shield, her eyes darting around the hallway as if looking for an escape route. They hadn't expected it to come to this. When David filed his motion challenging the CPS investigation and demanding a formal hearing, they'd assumed I would back down like I always had before. They'd counted on my fear of confrontation, my lifelong pattern of avoiding conflict to keep the peace, but they'd miscalculated. This time, I had something worth fighting for that was bigger than my own comfort. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation. Character witness statements from Emma's teacher, Tyler's coach, Dr. Williams, and a dozen neighbors and co-workers who'd observed my parenting over the years. Bank records showing consistent provision for my children's needs. School records demonstrating their academic success and emotional stability. A thick file documenting every interaction I'd had with my parents since the investigation began. Most importantly, David had uncovered the smoking gun that proved everything I'd suspected about their manipulation. Mrs. Henderson, it turned out, hadn't been as reliable a witness as my parents had hoped. When interviewed by the court-appointed investigator, she'd admitted that Linda had specifically asked her to keep an eye on Erika's situation and had suggested that certain behaviors might be cause for concern. She'd also revealed that my mother had called her the day after the grocery store incident to ask detailed questions about what she'd observed. Sarah Mitchell had been even more damaging to their case. Under oath, she'd testified that Robert had approached her at a community event and mentioned that the family was worried about Erika's adjustment to single motherhood. He'd asked if she'd noticed anything concerning about Tyler's behavior, and had specifically mentioned looking for signs of withdrawal or fear. When Sarah later observed Tyler being shy around adults, she'd interpreted it through the lens my father had provided. The pattern was clear. My parents had orchestrated a network of surveillance, priming their contacts to view my normal parenting through a suspicious lens and then encouraging them to report their observations to authorities. But the most devastating evidence had come from an unexpected source. Dr. Hamilton, the family therapist my parents had claimed to have arranged counseling with, had no record of any such arrangement. When David contacted his office, the receptionist confirmed that while my parents had called to inquire about services, they'd specifically asked about programs for parents who'd admitted to inappropriate discipline. They'd never actually scheduled any appointments or paid any fees. The judge had not been amused by this revelation. Now, as we waited for the final hearing to begin, I caught my father's eye across the hallway. For just a moment, his facade cracked, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Shame. Not the performative regret he'd shown when his plans started falling apart, but genuine recognition of what he'd done to his own daughter and grandchildren. David touched my elbow gently. "Ready?" I nodded, smoothing my navy blue dress and checking that my folder of documents was complete. Emma and Tyler were safely at school, unaware that their futures were being decided in a courtroom across town. I'd promised them ice cream for dinner if they had a good day, a small celebration, that I hoped would be appropriate by evening. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Patricia Williams called as we entered the courtroom. She was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind reading glasses. I'd researched her background and learned she had a reputation for fairness, but little tolerance for family manipulation tactics. "Your Honor," I responded, taking my seat at the plaintiff's table beside David. My parents sat across the aisle with their attorney, a nervous-looking man named Johnson, who'd specialized in estate planning before being thrust into this family law nightmare. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "We're here today to resolve the matter of Morrison versus Morrison regarding alleged child endangerment and the validity of related CPS proceedings," Judge Williams announced. "Mr. Chen, you've requested this hearing to challenge the investigation. Please present your case." David stood and approached the bench with the confidence of someone who knew he held all the winning cards. "Your Honor, this case represents one of the most egregious examples of family manipulation I've encountered in 20 years of practice. The defendants, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Morrison, systematically orchestrated false reports against their own daughter in order to gain custody of their grandchildren. For the next hour, David methodically dismantled my parents' case. He presented the timeline showing they'd applied to become emergency caregivers before any reports were filed. He played recorded phone calls where my mother could be heard coaching Mrs. Henderson on what details to emphasize in her statement. He showed the court the signed papers my parents had pressured me into completing, along with evidence that their attorney had prepared the documents weeks before any incidents occurred. But the moment that changed everything came when David called me to testify about the coercion I'd experienced. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "please tell the court about the circumstances under which you signed the documents in question." I'd practiced this testimony dozens of times, but standing in that courtroom with my parents watching, I felt the old familiar pressure to minimize, to smooth things over, to make everyone comfortable. Instead, I forced myself to tell the truth. My parents told me that people were already talking about my parenting and that CPS involvement was inevitable. They said that signing papers acknowledging problems would demonstrate my willingness to take responsibility and would protect me when authorities investigated. They made it clear that refusing to sign would make me look defensive and uncooperative. "Did you believe the problems described in those documents actually existed?" "No. I signed them because I was terrified of losing my children based on false allegations." My parents convinced me that admitting to fictional problems was the only way to prevent real consequences. "And how do you feel about that decision now?" "I feel manipulated. I feel betrayed by people who were supposed to protect me and my children. And I feel angry that I allowed their fear tactics to work." When my parents' attorney cross-examined me, he tried to paint me as a defensive mother who couldn't acknowledge legitimate concerns. But every question he asked gave me another opportunity to demonstrate my competence and love for my children. "Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that you've struggled with the challenges of single parenting?" Every single parent struggles with challenges. That doesn't make us abusive or unfit. Haven't there been incidents where you've lost your temper with the children? I've raised my voice when they were in danger or not listening about important safety issues. I've never screamed at them, called them names, or threatened them. But you did sign documents admitting to inappropriate discipline. I signed documents under duress because I was told it was the only way to protect my children from being removed from my care. Those documents don't reflect reality. The testimony that sealed my parents' fate came from an unexpected witness. Ms. Rodriguez, the original CPS caseworker, had been subpoenaed to testify about her observations during the investigation. Based on your professional experience, David asked her, what was your assessment of the family dynamics you observed? I found clear evidence of manipulation and coordination among the reporting parties, she replied without hesitation. The allegations against Mrs. Morrison appeared to be manufactured, while her interactions with her children were consistently appropriate and loving. Did you recommend any action against Mrs. Morrison? No. After completing my investigation, I determined that the children were not at risk and that the reports appeared to be motivated by factors other than genuine concern for child welfare. What factors? Control and custody motivations on the part of the maternal grandparents. When Judge Williams finally called for closing arguments, the outcome felt inevitable. My parents' attorney made a half-hearted attempt to argue that their concerns had been genuine, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. David's closing was devastating in its simplicity. Your Honor, this case is about what happens when grandparents decide they know better than a competent parent how children should be raised. Rather than expressing their concerns directly or offering support, the defendants chose manipulation, false accusations, and abuse of the child welfare system to achieve their goals. They've wasted court resources, traumatized their own family, and demonstrated a stunning lack of regard for the well-being of the children they claim to love. Judge Williams didn't need long to deliberate. When she returned to the bench 20 minutes later, her expression was grim. In 30 years on the bench, I've seen many cases involving family dysfunction and manipulation. This case stands out for the calculated nature of the defendants' actions and their complete disregard for the harm they were causing to their own grandchildren. She looked directly at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, your behavior has been reprehensible. You've abused the child welfare system, engaged in systematic harassment of your daughter, and attempted to gain custody of your grandchildren through fraudulent means. My mother started crying softly, but my father remained stone-faced. I'm issuing a restraining order prohibiting you from contacting Mrs. Morrison or her children, except through court-approved supervised visitation. I'm also ordering you to pay all legal fees and court costs associated with this proceeding. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for possible prosecution under the state's false reporting statutes. Making knowingly false reports to Child Protective Services is a felony, and your actions warrant serious consideration for criminal charges. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Outside the courthouse, David and I stood in the autumn sunshine while my parents and their attorney disappeared quickly into the parking garage. I felt numb, exhausted, and strangely empty after weeks of intense preparation and anxiety. It's over, David said simply. You won. Completely and decisively. I know. I just can't quite believe it yet. The restraining order means they can't contact you or the children without court permission. If they want visitation, they'll have to petition the court and demonstrate that they've addressed their behavior through counseling. Do you think they'll do that? Honestly, I doubt it. People who orchestrate schemes like this rarely take responsibility for their actions. They're more likely to blame you for the outcome than to examine their own choices. As if to prove his point, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother's number. I hope you're happy. You've destroyed this family. I showed the message to David, who shook his head. She's already violating the restraining order. Forward that to me and don't respond. I deleted the message without replying and put my phone away. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach when my parents tried to contact me. They couldn't hurt me anymore. More importantly, they couldn't hurt Emma and Tyler. When I picked up my children from school that afternoon, they were bubbling with excitement about their day. Emma had lost a tooth during lunch and was hoping the tooth fairy would visit. Tyler had scored the winning goal in soccer during recess and couldn't wait to tell me about it. "Can we really have ice cream for dinner?" Emma asked as we walked to the car. "Absolutely," I said, lifting her up and spinning her around. "We're celebrating." "What are we celebrating?" Tyler wanted to know. "We're celebrating being together," I said, "and we're celebrating that no one can ever try to take that away from us again." That evening, as we sat around our small kitchen table eating ice cream sundaes and laughing at Tyler's jokes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. Not the fragile quiet that came from avoiding conflict, but the deep contentment that came from knowing I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Emma fell asleep in my lap while we watched a movie, her small hand clutching mine even in sleep. Tyler curled up against my other side, his breathing growing heavy as exhaustion from his active day caught up with him. I sat there in the soft glow of the television, holding my children close and marveling at how simple happiness could be when you stopped letting other people complicate it. 6 months later, I received a letter from my parents' attorney informing me that they were moving to Arizona to be closer to my father's brother. They wouldn't be seeking visitation with Emma and Tyler. The letter was formal and brief, with no personal message or acknowledgement of what they'd put us through. I felt no sadness at the news, only relief. They'd made their choice when they decided to try to destroy my family rather than support it. Now they would live with the consequences of that choice, just as I was living with the freedom their absence provided. Emma and Tyler barely mentioned their grandparents after the first few weeks. Children are remarkably resilient when they're secure in their primary relationships, and they'd never been particularly close to my parents anyway. They were too busy with school and friends and soccer practice to miss people who'd always made them feel like they were being evaluated rather than loved. Rachel became our chosen family, the grandmother figure my children deserved. She attended their school performances and birthday parties, offered wisdom when I needed parenting advice, and provided the unconditional support that real family should offer. Sometimes, late at night after Emma and Tyler were asleep, I would think about the signed papers that had started this whole ordeal. Those documents that had once represented my shame and fear now sat in a file cabinet as evidence of my strength and victory. They reminded me that I'd survived the worst my parents could do to me and had emerged stronger than ever. I'd learned that truth really could set you free, but only if you were brave enough to speak it. I'd learned that love without respect wasn't love at all, but manipulation wearing a prettier mask. Most importantly, I'd learned that the family you create can be more valuable than the family you're born into. My children would grow up knowing they were loved unconditionally, that their voices mattered, that their experiences were valid. They would never have to choose between their own reality and someone else's version of truth. They would never have to sign papers admitting to things they didn't do just to keep the peace. And if anyone ever tried to make them doubt themselves the way my parents had made me doubt myself, they would have a mother who would fight for them with everything. She had. Because I'd learned that some battles are worth having, especially when the prize is the safety and happiness of the people you love most. The war my parents started had taught me who I really was. Not the weak, confused woman they'd tried to convince me I was, but someone strong enough to protect her children against any threat, even when that threat came from inside her own family. And that was a lesson worth every moment of pain it had taken to learn. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.